Okay, as I approach the tractor and trailer, I'm going to see if it's leaning to the left or to the right, which would indicate a flat tire, a shifted load, or a break in the suspension system. I'm going to look underneath the tractor for any leaks, and I'm going to look for damage on the front of the tractor. I'm sure you guys that have been doing this a long time will probably make fun of me, but I don't care. I'm new. But I do want to do it the right way. So if anybody has any good advice, I'd like to hear it. Okay, that's my radiator. I'm going to check the fluid, I'd remove the cap and look inside, add fluid as needed. That's my oil dipstick. I'd use that to check the oil level, and to fill the oil, I would fill that right in here. This is my alternator. Going to make sure it's properly mounted and secure, no loose or missing bolts. This is my belt. Going to make sure it's properly mounted and secured and not cracked or frayed, and that there's no more than 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch deflection. Going to check my wiring, make sure it's properly mounted and secure and not cracked or frayed. I'm going to check my hoses, make sure they're all properly mounted and secure, not cracked or leaking. You can check my exhaust, look for soot trails which would indicate an exhaust leak. And I'm going to do a general overview on this side of the engine, make sure nothing is broken, loose, missing, or leaking. I'm also going to check underneath the engine for any leaks. Okay, this is my power steering reservoir. To check the fluid, I'm going to remove the cap and look at the dipstick. If I need to add fluid, I would add it right here. I'm going to make sure my steering reservoir is properly mounted and secure, no loose or missing bolts, and it's not leaking. I'm going to check my hoses, make sure they're properly mounted and secure and not leaking, cracked, or frayed. It's my air compressor. I'm going to make sure it's properly mounted and secure, no loose or missing bolts, and not leaking. I'm going to check the hoses, make sure they're properly mounted and secure and not cracked or leaking. I'm also going to check my belts on this side, make sure they're properly mounted and secured, not cracked or frayed, and that there's no more than 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch deflection. This is my steering shaft. Going to make sure it's properly mounted and secure, not bent, cracked, or broken, and not welded. This is my steering box. Going to make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, and properly secured, no loose or missing bolts, and not leaking. That's my pitman arm. Going to make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, and properly secured. It's my drag link. Going to make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, and properly secured. Going to check my castle nuts. Make sure they're not missing, and that the cotter key is in place. That's my tie rod. Going to make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, and properly secured. That's my front axle. Going to make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, and properly secured. Going to check my spring shackles, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, and properly secured. Going to check my leaf springs, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured. There's no more than 1/4 of them missing, and they're not shifting. Going to check my spring U-bolts, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, and properly secured. Going to check my spring shackles, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured. Going to check my shock absorber, make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured, no loose or missing bolts, and not leaking. I'm also going to do a general overview on this side of the engine, make sure nothing is not bent, make sure nothing is not loose, missing, cracked, or leaking. I'm also going to look underneath the engine on this side to check for any leaks. And now I'm going to close the hood. Okay, it's my driver's side door. I'm going to make sure it opens and closes from the outside, of which it is locked and I do not have the key. It's my mirror mounting bracket. Going to make sure it's properly mounted and secured, no loose or missing bolts. Going to check my mirrors, make sure they're properly mounted and secured, not cracked or broken, and clean. I'm going to check my wires, make sure they're properly mounted and secure, not cracked or chafed. I'm going to check my turn signals, make sure they're properly mounted and secure, not cracked or broken, that they're working. I've got amber on the front and red in the back. So my grab handles, going to make sure that they're properly mounted and secure, no loose or missing bolts, and that they are clean, free of dirt and oil. So my driver steps, going to make sure that they're not bent, broken, or cracked, and that they're secure, and that they are clean, free of dirt and oil. This is my fuel tank. I'm going to check, and this is my fuel cap. I'm going to make sure it's properly mounted and secure and not leaking. Going to check my straps. I'm looking for shiny marks on the tank, which would indicate shifting of the tank. I'm going to check my crossover lines, make sure they're properly mounted and secured, not cracked or leaking, and not rubbing. And I'm going to look underneath the fuel tank for any leaks. It's my jockey box. I'm going to make sure it's properly closed and locked. My bleed lines, where I bleed my tanks at the end of the day to remove oil and water. It's my drive shaft. Going to make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured, no loose or missing bolts. I'm going to check my frame and cross members, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured, no loose or missing bolts. I'm going to check my exhaust. I'm going to make sure it's properly mounted and secure. I'm going to look for rust trails on the nuts, which would indicate a loose nut. I'm going to look for holes, cracks, or dents in the exhaust, and I'm also going to look for soot trails on the exhaust, which would indicate a leak in the exhaust system. I'm going to check my air lines, make sure they're properly mounted and secure from both ends. I'm going to make sure that they're not cracked, worn, or chafed, they're not leaking, and they're not going to get tangled on the tractor parts. I'm going to check my electrical lines, make sure they're properly mounted and secure from both ends. They're not cracked, worn, or chafed, and that they're not going to get tangled inside the tractor parts. I'm going to check my glad hands, make sure they're properly mounted and secure, not broken. I'm going to check my catwalk and deck plate, make sure it's properly mounted and secure, no loose or missing bolts. It's my battery box, I'm going to make sure it's properly mounted and secure. It's my header board, going to make sure it's properly mounted and secure, not cracked. Okay, this is my fifth wheel. I'm going to check, make sure I have my fifth wheel, I have all my fifth wheel nuts. I'm going to look for rust trails on the nuts, which would indicate a loose nut, and I'm going to look for shiny marks on the frame, which would indicate shifting of the fifth wheel platform. I'm going to check my fifth wheel mounting platform, make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, and properly secured, no loose or missing nuts, pins, bolts, or cotter keys. I'm going to check my fifth wheel release arm, make sure it's locked and engaged, or in the otherwise correct position. I'm going to check my fifth wheel skid plate, make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured, no loose or missing nuts and bolts. And properly greased. I'm going to check my apron plate, make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured, no loose or missing nuts and bolts, and properly greased. Before coupling, I'm going to check my kingpin, make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured, properly greased. I'm going to check my fifth wheel locking pin, make sure it's not missing or broken, and that it's properly locked and engaged, and that the fifth wheel is in the correct position, as though the tractor is not going to come in contact with the trailer or landing gear. This is my landing gear. Going to make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured, no loose or missing bolts. It's in the fully upright position, and the handle is secured. See, I'm going to check my trailer frame and cross members, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured, no loose or missing bolts. I'm going to look on the trailer floor, make sure it's not broken or have holes in it. I'm going to check the side of the trailer for any damage. I'm going to check my lights and reflectors, make sure none are missing and that they're not cracked or broken, or properly secured. If I had chains, I would make sure they're properly secured and not dragging. I'm going to check my air lines, make sure they're properly mounted and secured, not dragging, and no audible air leaks. It's my tandem release arm. I'm going to make sure it's not broken. My tandem pins, I'm going to make sure that they're not missing, broken, and that they're properly engaged. my hub oil axle seal. To check the oil, I would look through the sight glass. If I could not do that, I would remove this cap, stick my finger inside, and add oil if needed. I'm also going to check for any oil leaks. I'm going to check my lug nuts, make sure I have a full set. I'm going to look for rust trails, which would indicate a loose nut, and I can check for tightness by hand or with the lug wrench. Excuse me. This is my rim. Going to make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured. This is my bead flange. Going to make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured. Going to check the wall of the tire for any bumps, cuts, or abrasions. Going to make sure I don't have any mixed match tires. Going to make sure I've got at least 4 30-second tread on my steer tires and 2 30-seconds on all other tires. I'm going to check for my inflation with a gauge or a bud bar. I'm going to make sure my duals aren't touching and that there's no debris in between the duals. I'm going to check for my brake return spring, make sure it's not missing or broken. I'm going to check my brake drums and linings, make sure my linings are at least 1/4 inch thick, they're not cracked or broken, and that there's no dirt or oil in the linings. I'm going to make sure my brake drums are not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, that they're properly secure. Check my S-cam shaft, make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded and properly secured. I'm going to check my push rod, make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured with pin and cotter key. Going to check my slack adjusters, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured with brakes applied. Angle on the slack adjuster should not be less than 90 degrees. With wheels chalked and brakes released, I can pull on the slack adjuster with the gloved hand. It should not give more than 1 inch. If it does give more than 1 inch, then they need to be adjusted. I'm going to check my brake chambers, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured, no loose or missing bolts, and that they're not leaking. I'm going to check my air hoses and lines, going to make sure they're not bent, that they're properly secured and not cracked or worn and not leaking. Now this is an air ride suspension. We're going to pretend it's a leaf spring suspension, because that's what we train on. That's what we test on. Okay, so my spring hangers, going to make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured. Going to check my leaf springs, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured. No more than 1/4 of them missing and they're not shifting. Going to check my spring U-bolts, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured. Going to check my spring shackles, make sure they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured. Going to check my radius rod and my torque arm, make sure that they're not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, properly secured, and no loose or missing nuts and bolts. I'm going to check my tandem frame, make sure it's not bent, broken, cracked, or welded, and properly secured, and no loose or missing nuts, bolts, pins, or cotter keys. My mud flap, going to make sure it's properly mounted and secure, it's not ripped or torn, and it's no more than 10 inches off the ground or 4 feet from the tire. It's my DOT bar, going to make sure it's properly mounted and secured and not cracked or broken. It's my license plate, going to make sure it's properly mounted and secure and clean. These are my doors, my trailer doors, going to make sure that they're properly secured and closed and that the latches are locked and closed in place. I'm going to check my hinges, make sure I don't have any missing nuts or bolts, and that each hinge has a pin and cotter key. I'm going to check my clearance lights and reflectors, make sure that none are missing, they're not cracked or broken, and that they're in good working order. I will do the same on the other side, as well as inspect all leaf springs and axles and all tires. And that concludes this portion of the pre-trip inspection.